always on the books and they're not going to change. But we also said in our system, there's some flexibility, some discretion that's built into it. Therefore, we have to deal with ethical relativism, because we don't live in a society where everything is always black and white. Some societies feel, I hope you know how to write with your other hand. They will immediately remove the hand that stole. In our society, we tend to be more flexible. You get drunk driving, you might get a MIP, a minor in possession, you might get maybe a second-degree DUI, whatever, but they may not impose the maximum penalty. So we come to the point of ethical relativism. Moral truths are not absolutely true, but true relative to some particular set of standards. Different societies have different standards that they follow. Cultural relativism, moral truths are not absolutely true, but relative to a particular society. So our society views things one way, a different society may view things another way. Whether an act is right or wrong depends on the moral. When you see norms, this is a word you'll see on your quizzes, it just means values of society and not on an absolute standard. So one of the absolute standards we all say we agree with is thou shalt not kill. Every major culture has that value. Every major religion has that culture. Yet you're allowed to defend yourself, self-defense. And you're allowed to go to war as a nation and protect your population. But the overall or overriding value is thou shalt not kill. Some cultures, the Jainists, Jainist, they'll walk through the streets with a broom and they're not about to even step on bugs. Bugs have a right to life just like you do. They're going to try and sweep away any trouble before them. It's not that it's absolute. They might not see a bug, but for us it's like, right? Or maybe not. Individual relativism, moral truths are not absolute, but relative to the individual. So you might hold a certain, let's say, conservative value, but in some other area you may adopt maybe a liberal or libertarian value. That's based on how you personally think life should be reflected. Whether an act is right or wrong depends on the convictions of the person performing it and not on some absolute standard. Someone kidnaps my kid and holds him for ransom because I win the lotto tonight, and I give them their money and they kill my kid anyway, and I got an attitude. And I know what the law says, but I got an attitude. But I know what the law says. And I follow the law. Except when I get an attitude. Under limited circumstances. But I got me an attitude now. Okay. So you follow that? I've also posted up here a quick note, and I'll go over some of this for you. We're going to cover this now. I don't know if I'll have time or the inclination to want to go over it, but it explains the two principles. One we're going to study is called deontology, the other is going to be called teleology. I'll go over that for you. But I don't want to do that anyway. Any questions so far?
I have one. I know when you said the castle doctrine, and it's an absolute, it's a law, it's written in stone. I guess the ambiguity comes in when it actually goes to trial. And then I'm thinking Trayvon Martin, I'm thinking, how it's applied if someone accidentally shoots their kid that's coming home late and they think it's a burglar kind of thing. I think that's where it gets squishy, when you follow the law, but at what point does the law not back you up, or back you up when you're really not following the law? I guess those are questions that we get to be.
So did that happen to the Olympian? I know it's not even in America. The
Blade Runner.
Yeah,
The Blade Runner.
Yeah, it's like the same kind of.
Yeah, well,
He also lives in the house, but
his
He
defense
shot
fell
through a door,
apart.
right?
Yeah.
Shot her through the bathroom door.
Bathroom door, yeah.
Yeah, his defense fell apart. And you can have similar situations and they're adjudicated or they're judged differently. Supreme Court just decided in Florida, you have a judge who can override a jury when it comes to capital punishment, when it comes to the death penalty. And they said, that's not fair. That's why we have a jury of peers. It comes out of a law 1215 called the Magna Carta out of England. It's the basis or the foundation of all of our jurisprudence, of all of our law. right to a trial by your peers. We'll get into that, I'll get into that for sure later on this semester. And Florida, they said that a judge can override, if he thinks the jury is not deliberated correctly, he can override it to bring true justice. Well, that's part of the issue with ethics people, is ethics, while we want it to be written in stone, and in some situations it is no lying, stealing, cheating, raping, robbing, the way we apply it, or the circumstances, or the discretion we use within it, creates issues that need to be resolved. And in democracy, you rarely have resolution. There's always someone who's got a contrarian opinion. And we're allowed to have that. That's what libertarianism allows us. We can have different opinions. What do we do when we fall into a situation we don't agree? Well, guess what? We don't agree right now. I mean, I'm not going to tell you how old this dinosaur is, but I've never seen this country so politically divided in my life. I mean, we used to find a way to compromise. One party got 80% of what they wanted. They gave you 20%. You want 80%? Get elected next time and we'll take the 20%. Now it's all or nothing. It's an interesting time to live.
It's almost like even with the president's speech last night, a lot of what I'm hearing is that,
I don't want to go into politics.
well,
Go ahead.
just the idea that cooperation is not considered a good thing right now, which I think is ridiculous. That
A lot of people want
compromise.
things their way. How many of you would not like things your way, willing to be sacrificial all the time? How many want less rather than more? Most of us would prefer to get our, how many of you would like a C instead of an A? Really, come on, I have to give some C's out. Someone asked me one day, one with first day class, they said, do you do a bell curve? And I said, well, let me guess what that means. That means if you don't get a high enough grade, you want me to raise the grades. Well, yeah. And I said, so what if everybody gets good grades? And if I'm going to be fair, don't I have to back everybody? And they said, well, no, we don't want a bell curve. Okay, fine. But I know everybody wants a bell curve. Everybody wants an A. I understand that. I want an A. Okay, so let's go to the principles then. When it comes to human behavior, there's only three parts of human behavior we have to pay attention to. In the initial analysis, there's a motive, there's an action, and every action leads to a consequence, regardless of the nature of the consequence. That's as simple as human behavior gets. Now, for those of you who've had ethics with me before, this is a review. For the longest time, going back about 2,300 years, there's a Greek philosopher named Aristotle. And he said what's important when it comes to evaluating human behavior is the consequences of our actions. And if you do something that produces a bad consequence, you probably shouldn't have done it. That was not a good action. If you do something and it produces a good consequence, well, that was probably a good action. It makes sense to us. And Aristotle called this, of course he's a Greek, he gave it a Greek label called teleology. You have to know this, you'll see this on your exam, so if you take a note, you write it down. Teleology is really two Greek words. When you see the word ology, that always means the study of whatever comes before it. The Greek word that comes before it is a word called telos. And telos literally means ends, or purposes, or consequences. So teleology is the study of the consequences of human behavior. We call it consequentialism. Okay? And for 2,300 years, this is how the Western world has looked at ethics. If what you do produces a desirable consequence, we call it a good action. If it produces a negative consequence, we're going to call it a negative action. That makes sense to us. In fact, let me say this to you, all action is purpose-driven. Everything you do has a reason for why you're doing it. You're looking for a consequence, even when the consequence is kind of irrelevant. Why do you put clothes on? Because you get busted if you don't. But what kind of clothes do you put on? Some days you get up and just throw on whatever's at hand. You don't care. I mean, I'm required to look pretty. So I kind of go through the wardrobe and pick some things out. Some days I look as ugly as I did when I wasn't wearing clothes. But the consequences of what you put on may not be important when you put things on, because the consequences of not having clothing on is unacceptable. You don't want to be fined. So everything you do has a purpose. What you eat, maybe you're just hungry. You don't care what you put in your face. I don't care. Or maybe you do. Maybe you're trying to lose weight. Maybe you're trying to build muscle mass. Maybe you're doing whatever you're doing. So you have a purpose or consequence in mind, and that dictates your action. That's teleology, plain and simple. Everything in life is purpose-driven. Regardless of whether it has moral content or whether it's some great grand scheme that we're trying to achieve or whatever. So everybody follow a simple principle. We're talking about two principles. This is the first principle, and this is dominated. This principle has dominated ethical life in the Western world since Aristotle came up with it 2,300 years ago. Okay, let's take this principle then and apply it. I'm going to assume that most of us would desire a reasonable amount of wealth to live comfortably while we're still here on the planet. I mean, just go into Publix and take something off the shelf and try and go out without paying for it and see what happens. There's a price to everything in life. Okay, so what actions do we take to produce wealth? Well, the first one is obvious. I'm assuming you're all here because you think if you get a good enough education, the job market will open a little wider for you, and if you focus on the areas where jobs might be available, and the good paying jobs are available, you might end up doing very well in life. And without an education, the mantra right now is you're probably going to be stuck in a minimum wage job the rest of your life. So you might as well go to school and get an education. Even if it doesn't produce the desired consequence, it has the potential to produce a consequence better than not getting educated at all. So we follow why we do that. But that's not the only way to produce wealth. Tonight, while the odds are horrible, 292 against 1, that you're going to win the lottery, a $2 investment just might make you a very wealthy person. Now, we know after people win the lottery, sometimes life turns really bad because they don't know how to handle wealth. But I don't think I've ever met or heard of anyone who said, you know, I wish I'd have spent that $2 on a beer last night instead of winning $1.5 billion. You just don't hear that. Now, all theories have an upside, they have a downside. I don't know of anyone who'd argue with this. Some people say, well, that's gambling, that's not really moral. So there's some people have an issue with that. But people who play the lottery obviously don't have an issue or they wouldn't be playing with it. And enough people play it because they think there's a value to it that's acceptable. If it produces the desired consequence, we presume they're very happy about it. But that's not the only way to produce wealth. Now, I'm not endorsing this or encouraging it. But there's a reason that people steal. A fair amount of crime goes unreported, and a fair amount of crime goes unsolved. Right? I have a friend, a state police officer in northern Michigan. Michael got talking to me one day. He says, boy, you won't believe what happened down in Dearborn. And Dearborn is north of Detroit. Detroit. Yeah, I met an old white guy who used to wear his pants up here. He was a teacher in the city. And I always used to call him Leroy. And he said to me one day, he says, you know, my name is Leroy. And I said, yeah, I know, and you probably come from Detroit, right? And I said, where I come from, you're Leroy, and you come from Detroit. So Michael was telling me, he said, so this fellow's living in Bloomfield Hills, very, very wealthy area north of Detroit. And he comes home one day after work, owns a business, employs many people, comes home, he's driving a BMW 7 Series. He's got a grip that everybody envies. Comes home from work, parks the car, goes inside, he and Mama have dinner, spend the night together, go to sleep, gets up next morning, go to work, and the dinner is not in